Hello and welcome, everybody. Today I'm going to be doing a 2024 Governor Glenn Youngkin versus Kamala Harris election prediction. This is not really a likely scenario. I don't think it happens. And realistically, Youngkin is in no way a frontrunner for the Republican nomination. Harris, I could see potentially running in 2024, assuming Biden doesn't. But that still stands that this could be an interesting election prediction, and it'd be interesting to look into how this would potentially turn out. So, before I start, I just want to ask that everybody, if you're new, please consider subscribing and leaving a like, and also turn on the bell notification if you want to be updated when videos go live. Now, we'll start with doing, as usual, the Republican safe states. This would be in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Nebraska, except for the district, South Dakota, North Dakota, Kansas. These are all very typical. Everyone, not Georgia. Everyone knows these. These are normal states that we all expect to be safe Republican. I don't need to explain why those are safe Republican, but if I do, I'll be pretty blunt. They've been safe for a while. They're quite Republican in margins, and none of them are really trending to the left. Some are to the right. So, these are the safe Republican. Now, safe Democrat in this case, I do think, well, I always forget that district. But I do think as a whole, these will be the safe Democrat states in this scenario, except for maybe New Jersey. I'll explain that one a little bit more in the future. But I do think these would be the safe Democrat states in this scenario. So these are fairly close to the same, nothing really out of the ordinary here. This is quite normal. This is still the 2024 cycle, so a lot of trends and polling data is going to have to be pulled from the 2020 election, as well as polling from either Trump or DeSantis, because there really aren't any polls showing Youngkin versus any candidate, because he hasn't really been considered by most as a candidate. So now, my position on Youngkin overall, I don't mind him. He's much better than McAuliffe, and overall, he's a decent governor. But I do have some issues. He's a little too moderate at times, but in some ways that would play well into a 2024 electoral run. So, if we look at the actual polling data here, we can see in any cases where Harris is put up in polls, there's not many, there's only like 3 of them in here. She is behind in all 3 of them. Here as well, oh, all 4 of them then. She is behind in every single one by a decent margin, and this is just popular vote as a whole, which is fairly important to consider. And overall, her approval is not very high. People do not like her. She doesn't poll well, and that would also have a net negative overall on her likability and electability, especially when we consider Youngkin, who's more of a moderate type Republican, but also still being that America First type Republican that campaigns on the cultural issues, which are the winning issues for Republicans. He would be able to pick up a lot of the Trump base quite effectively, but also pick up a lot of more suburban, moderate voters in general. He did well in the more suburban areas based on his appeal, which is something that will help him in a federal election. Now, he did quite well in Virginia. Obviously, he managed to get out pretty important areas to vote. Now, it doesn't mean Virginia is for sure a win for him. It is in play. I'll explain and look more in depth on Virginia as a whole in a minute, but we'll move on to likely states in this scenario. Texas would be likely. It went for Trump by 8% in the last election. Now, that was again in a blue national environment against Biden, who is not a good candidate, but better than Kamala. Kamala just is not going to be able to get people out to vote in Texas. And the biggest issue with Texas, most of the southern parts of the state down here, as we can see, they all trended more or less to the right from 2016. But these regions, the more suburban areas, trended to the left. These kinds of like San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, they trended to the left. But you have to consider Trump didn't necessarily have good suburban appeal, but Youngkin does, which overall would help him more than likely increase his overall vote totals in these regions and potentially maximize them a little bit, which would help him turn the state further back, as well as the Latino communities that are still shifting to the right, and I think that trend would continue. So as a whole, I think Texas would be likely. I also think Florida is likely, with overall DeSantis's effect in the state, the way he's governed, and how many people have moved to the state. If we look here in Florida, the state itself trended to the right in almost every column. It is becoming a lean to likely state already. It went for Trump by about 3 points, which is a pretty large margin, which Republicans have not gotten there in a long time, and neither have Democrats. Usually the state's within 1 or 2 points at best. So it is a sign of what's to come, and now we saw in polling data, if we actually look up here, we can see in the governor's polling data overall in Florida, the state is 7 ahead for DeSantis, and that's underestimating more than likely. DeSantis will probably win by 10 to 11, maybe even more in the election, which is huge. It will likely be much safer of a state in the future for Republicans. And we have to also consider most polls underestimate Republicans by around 2 to 3%. So if we consider this polling data, it is very, very, very possible that Republicans would be even closer, especially if we considered the polling for Kamala Harris, which had her behind by about 3 or 4, and almost all of them against Trump. So with that negative appeal, and then the appeal that Youngkin actually has, he would do quite well. So I do think Florida would be a likely state in this scenario, and I'm also going to go with Wisconsin being a likely state. It was only won by Biden by 20,000 votes. Still doubt that, but won by 20,000 votes. That is easily a margin to make up. The state is trending to the right. If we consider the 2016 results, we saw Trump won it by a decent margin. The state, as well as Ron Johnson, who's going to obviously win. We also have Tim Michels running for governorship. He will probably win as well at this point. And most polling underestimates the Rust Belt, in Republicans in the Rust Belt quite a bit, and Republicans are very close there right now. I do think overall Wisconsin goes, I'd say likely. I do think it would go in a likely margin for Youngkin, because the biggest thing with Wisconsin as well is these more suburban areas. They're going to get out and vote. The Madison, Milwaukee, Kenosha, Green Bay areas are going to maximize more for Youngkin, and then these more Trump rural regions are very likely to go for Youngkin, because he still has that mega culture war appeal, which is necessary if he wants to win the election. And as well, I think Pennsylvania being that more economic Rust Belt state, I don't think it's likely, but it could be lean. So the last likely state, I think, would be North Carolina. If we look here, North Carolina, there's a decent amount of that suburban vote. Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Raleigh, and Charlotte. That's where the election ultimately, other than up here, this section of the state, obviously, it votes fairly Democrat, but overall, these regions would end up voting closer for the Republican in Youngkin because of his appeal, as well as being in close proximity to Virginia. I feel like that would at least have some effect on his overall electability in the state. And Trump still won the state by about 1.3%, which, despite the state in the past being much more conservative, it's not really trending any direction. But I do think it could trend at least a bit back to the right with the right candidate in Youngkin. So Youngkin would win the state in a likely margin. Now, we'll go on to likely states for Democrats. It's not a huge list, but New Jersey. Now, the reason I say this is because during the election year for Virginia, we also saw New Jersey get somewhat close for the Republicans. That doesn't mean that it would necessarily go any closer, but I do think it's possible it could get within a likely margin. The state sort of trended a little bit to the right in 2021. I don't know if it would continue, but it's a possibility. I do think it's one of the few states in this region that could potentially in the next 20 years become a Republican state. It's not necessarily likely, but again, the suburban appeal could help in these kinds of regions. It's not guaranteed, but it's very possible it helps in these regions and potentially gets the state closer. It wouldn't be a win. I don't think that's even close to achievable, but it would be closer. So continuing, we also have for the... No, actually, we don't have any more likely Democrat states. So moving on to lean, I do think Nebraska's district here would go lean Republican. I'm not going to speak too much about that suburban vote, the appeal that he would bring. He also is appealing to moderates, so that would help in these states a little bit and potentially around this area. So we have to consider that data. Now, I think Georgia would be lean. He's going to do well in the Atlanta suburbs. Not enough to massively reverse these trends, but in these regions, he can get the margins closer. He wouldn't win any of them, I don't think, but with 5 points closer in each of them, that's enough to probably win the state alone. And then again, around the Columbus, Augusta, and Savannah area, again, could get a bit closer in all of them. And then the moderate appeal helps in a state like Georgia, which is in some ways more of a moderate state. We also see their current governor polling 8 or so points ahead. He'll probably win by about 10 in a safe margin at this point. Brian Kemp's going to win it. So the state still, and actually, you know what? Even Herschel Walker is polling ahead right now of Warnock. So the state is still very winnable, and I do think in a lean margin it would go Republican, especially with Youngkin on the ticket. Now, another lean state, I'd go Arizona. This one was very close. It was only 0.4% for Biden, but still have to consider that the state itself is not really trending that far to the left, and right now, even polling for the most part has pretty close for both Senate and governorship. Kari Lake and Masters very close. They both probably do win, and I think I'm going to stand by that when they win in November. The leftists who are going to get offended by that, please stay offended. But I do think Maricopa would flip back in this case, which is enough to switch the state right back to the Republican column. So in the lean margin, I do think Arizona goes that way, and Nevada as well, a state trending to the right. It's really just about Washoe and Clark County where they need to win. The Las Vegas suburbs, that would trend to the right under a Governor Youngkin ticket. Plus, the state itself is more of a moderate state in some regards. So overall, his moderate appeal would help in the Reno, Las Vegas areas, and I do think would trend the state far enough to be a lean state. The state itself has already trended so far to the right, even from a few years ago. It went from like a D plus 12 state to a plus 2 or 3 now. So the state is very much winnable. It's in play for Republicans. They're going to win the governor and Senate seats there easily in the midterms. So we also have, I think, the last lean state, and that would be a Pennsylvania lean. This one, I'm not going to speak too much on it. It is fairly suburban, so Youngkin does well. But the state itself is, I'd say, trending to the right, and Oz likely, I think, wins the election there, as well as Mastriano over Shapiro and Ogre Fetterman, who is one stroke away from completely incapacitated at this point. So Pennsylvania is lean as well. And lastly, I think Democrat for the leans. I'd give Maine at large just barely in a lean margin for the Democrats as a whole. It is a state that could potentially get closer. Not necessarily much closer, but I think it could. Like, it's not, I don't think it's winnable, but I do think lean margin is possible. To get it down to a lean margin for Republicans is possible. It's one of the most Republican states up in this region, as well as New Hampshire, but overall, I think it is possible. Now, New Hampshire, actually, I'm going to put that, no, I'm not going to mess with that right now. So, another lean, I think Colorado is a lean, and so is New Mexico in this case. Pretty close. Well, at least Colorado itself is a suburban state, a very, like, suburbs, that kind of thing. That's, as you can see in the Denver area, Denver Boulder region, there's a lot of the suburban votes there, and that's one of the biggest reasons the state is voting so far Democrat. Like, the Denver region itself is huge. So is the Adams, the Arapahoe, and Jefferson, as well as Boulder and Broomfield. So overall, that region alone pretty much makes up most of the state's voting and ultimately decides the election. But in a place like Pueblo, I do think Youngkin could probably surpass that margin. That's only a 2-point margin. Same in Garfield, and even potentially in Chaffee. That's the thing. So this is a state that is potentially, the margins can get closer, but I don't think it's winnable. And I think New Mexico is similar with that more suburban part of the state here, but it's not winnable in this scenario, even if Ron Chetty wins. I don't think it's really winnable. It's possible it could be closer and maybe even a tilt margin, but more than likely, New Mexico would be lean Democrat. Now, moving on to tilt states. I think New Hampshire would be tilt Republican in this case. It is a very suburban state, but I think the moderate appeal would actually help quite a bit in New Hampshire. And overall, I do think Youngkin could actually potentially win the state. He's more appealing to these kinds of voters than Trump is, I think, which would help him a lot. And Trump even has a chance to potentially win it in 2024. Not guaranteed, but it's possible. Now, I also do think Michigan in this scenario would get close enough again and would flip back Republican. Again, the suburban appeal and the moderate appeal, especially in a state like Michigan, but still being that, again, conservative culture warrior type candidate would be enough to get him over the edge and put it in a tilt margin. Now, Minnesota could be something that would actually be somewhat close. I don't know. Realistically, I don't think Youngkin wins it, but I do think it's in a tilt margin, especially with how it's currently trending. There are a lot of polls that show potentially the governorship could go to Republicans in the midterms, and I think that could possibly roll over into a 2024 election with Youngkin on the ticket. And again, we have to just consider how unappealing Harris is and how little people actually like her. Finally, we have Virginia. I purposely left this for last because it's his home state, and it would ultimately be the most interesting part of the election to watch, because him being home state there, him being the former governor in this case, he could potentially win it, even though the state, yes, was D plus 10. So we'll look at this right here, 2020 results, D plus 10 for Biden, but it's not massively gone. Most of it is ultimately decided by the Nova region of the state, but in his election, he managed to get very close in some of these regions, like around here. Now, obviously, these were still fairly far, but this is much, much closer than Trump's election margins. Now, Alexandria is not going to be winnable, obviously. Neither is Arlington, but these regions could be closer. I don't think winnable, but like Stafford, I'm pretty sure Stafford went, yes, it went for Biden by 3%. In the election for his governorship, he won it by 11%. So it's very possible if he can get similar margins in the suburbs, it still has that same appeal. He can even do close to as good like in this region here. As we can see down here, in the Suffolk, Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach cities, these all went Democrat. But he managed to get the margins close enough to at least get these two, Chesapeake and Virginia Beach, and Suffolk was very close. So if he can keep up these kinds of margins into a 2024 presidential election, admittedly statewide elections are different, he won it by 2% here. I do think he could ultimately win Virginia in a tilt like 0.2% margin. It would be close, but again, Harris's appeal is not really there. It's not going to help her. So as a whole, I think Youngkin would win Virginia, and it would be a very close margin, but he would also win the election with 330 electoral votes to Kamala Harris's 208. Anyways, if you guys liked that video, you agreed with my breakdown, or if you have any opinions on it, please let me know. Leave a like on the video and subscribe if you are new. I post daily videos and any other types of election content, policy, that kind of stuff, I post it. So if you want to see more of that, check out some of my other videos. Anyways, that's all for now. Hope you guys have a good night.